A lot of these things were happening anyway, and the political flux had started before she came on the scene. In some ways, what she did was to crystallise the issue and to start talking about things like the need for trade union reform, the need for a more liberal market approach to managing the economy, about people changing attitudes, old entrenched attitudes. That was being thrown up anyway because the old way of life was crumbling around people's ears anyway.
Had both sides of industry only realised that in future they had to take responsibility for their own actions and that they would not automatically be bailed out regardless of their performance, hundreds of thousands of worthwhile jobs would have survived the recession.
She was accused of turning Scotland into a desert. All she was doing was clearing away the debris of what was already a desert on a life support machine, and the life support machine was one fed by taxation pumped in by the Westminster government. It couldn't go on.
And this was the narrative that began, gradually at first, to fix itself in the English imagination, that of the surly, brooding, taciturn, reform-resistant Scot, and of Scotland a subsidy junkie, addicted to and paralysed by subsidy from the dynamic, wealth-creating South. Why did England and Scotland come to such radically different points of view?
There had not been the benefits of Thatcherism in Scotland. Because the Scottish establishment had been so sluggish in accepting Thatcherism, there had been no privatisations in Scotland. There was no privatisation in Scotland before 1987. There were not working class people with shares in their pockets, watching the value of those shares rise and feeling richer all of a sudden. Popular Thatcherism had not come to Scotland, and so there was nothing offsetting the pain.
A political identity had mapped itself onto the landscape of old industrial Scotland. Communities that knew they owed their livelihoods to something called British Steel were naturally suspicious of the SNP, a party that wanted to break up the very state that paid the wages. And when the industrial landscape changes, the politics will surely follow.
It's taken years, but the redevelopment of this site has begun at last, and the Ravenscraig that future generations of school leavers will inherit will be quite different. Hundreds of private new homes are being built. There's to be a huge regional sports centre and the gleaming glass towers of a college of further education. There's to be a new town centre with shops and bars and restaurants and a new business park. That is what is covering over the old industrial Scotland. And as that old Scotland recedes into the distant memory, so too do many of the certainties that came with it. Those rock-solid, Labour-voting communities that owed their livelihoods to the nationalised industries of the post-war British state, gone. And with them, many of the settled political and national loyalties that they sustained.
In politics, perception is everything. Personality is as important as policy. And in personality, Mrs. Thatcher packed quite a punch. There was just something about Maggie that played to Scotland's less admirable instincts. She was just so grandly, aggressively, self-confidently, irritatingly and irredeemably Southern. She touched the raw nerve of Scotland's capacity for anti-Englishness.
She was a woman, she was an English woman, she was a bossy English woman. And they could probably have put up with one or possibly even two of these, but all three simultaneously, a bit too much. Her style just grated. Partly the voice, partly the priorities, but partly also this extraordinary, able and impressive woman. There were certain things that she couldn't comprehend. For example, here's this great British patriot, deeply suspicious of the European dimension and determined to protect Britain's identity against Europe, but found it very difficult to see that within the United Kingdom there was a similar relationship, Scotland to England, as she was seeking to protect Britain to Europe. It's not that she couldn't understand it, she couldn't empathise with it.
me. I went along to her room in the House of Commons, and it was amusing in some respects because she allowed me to say my piece about the need for this engineering workshops to remain open, because the people of Scotland were still very dependent upon public transport, and the skilled workers in that workshops were doing a good job, etc. Having said my piece, she then gave her reply. She said, "Mr. Canavan, I understand your concern about the high unemployment in Falkirk." I said, "Prime Minister, it's not Falkirk, it's Falkirk." She said, "Oh, Falkirk, what does it matter? I mean, here was a woman who was just, she was such a megalomaniac. She had the power to change the pronunciation of Scottish place names."
It's not that Mrs. Thatcher didn't try to connect with Scottish sentiment. She wanted the people on her side, wanted to belong in Scotland as much as she did in England. In one infamous television exchange, she tried perhaps too hard.
I and Michael Forsyth were briefing her beforehand, and I said to her, "You know, Margaret, when you're being interviewed, try not to..." I've often heard when you're in Scotland, you talk about you in Scotland do this, you in Scotland do that. I said, it sounds as if you're visiting another country. You know, you're Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Try not to use that phrase. He said, absolutely, good point. Absolutely, I will remember that. Thank you very much.
It looks from the latest figures as if we in Scotland are going to have higher growth than the people further south.
Michael and I were watching on the monitor, and suddenly we heard her saying, "we in Scotland." And the first time we thought, well, you know, nobody will notice. She said it 2 or 3 times. "We in Scotland, we in Scotland."
I was very perturbed at the last election that we in Scotland hadn't quite had the full benefit of the increasing number of jobs that there were. There are 2 points. One which applies to us in Scotland just as much as it does elsewhere. What will happen down south is the same thing that's happened to us in Scotland.
And I thought, God, this extraordinary woman who's so brilliant and so able in so many ways, she understood the problem I'd been trying to tell her. She didn't appreciate the solution was infinitely worse. And, you know, that was the difficulty we had from time to time.
That personality, the voice, the manner became totemic. Many in Scotland began to see them as distinctive of a set of values. Values that were expressly English, that somehow ran contrary to a different and sometimes hostile set of values that were Scots. And it wasn't just the anti-Thatcher left that worried about it.
She was English and she was on their wavelength. She wasn't on the Scottish wavelength, I don't think. The Scots that she was on a wavelength with were Adam Smith and David Hume, but they were dead. They didn't have a vote, and they didn't have much influence on everyday Scots. And Scotland is a more consensual place. There is less of an us and them attitude in society in Scotland. I think Scotland is more of a village in many ways. It's a smaller country, and I don't think that what she said, and indeed the manner in which she said it, came across so favourably in Scotland as it did in the south. And this puzzled her, because she admired many of the qualities of Scots. She shared them: self-reliance, thrift, all the things that had made Scotland a great country in many ways. But she didn't quite understand the extent to which Scotland was in thrall to socialism and the dependency culture. It was more deep-rooted than she realised.
It wasn't that people perhaps were anti-English just like that, but aspects of Englishness got on people's nerves increasingly in that decade. As I say, it was a voice which reminded people, Mrs. Thatcher's voice. People really hated that voice. You know, they shuddered, turned the radio off. You can say, yes, it was something to do with an ethnic distaste.
Time and again, the Scottish ministerial team have richly earned the collective title which I believe some jealous Sassenachs imposed upon them, that of the Tartan Mafia. But I must say that George Younger makes a most benevolent godfather.
Lots of the people who were essentially the public face of the Conservative Party in Scotland, folk like George Younger, Alec Buchanan Smith, Malcolm Rifkin, were seen as very much on the patrician or paternalist wing of the Conservative Party, and they presented themselves to Scottish media opinion as essentially Scotland's protectors against what some people might have seen in Scotland as the wilder excesses of Thatcherism. So George Younger made great play of the fact that he was the defender of Ravenscraig, the defender of Scotland's industrial virility against Margaret Thatcher. But one of the consequences of that was that people got the impression that somehow Margaret Thatcher and the ideas that she stood for were inimical to Scottish values, and therefore Scottish conservatism could only survive by holding Thatcherism at bay rather than by adapting Thatcherism to Scottish contours.
And so when even Scotland's Conservative leaders were perceived as having to protect Scotland from Mrs Thatcher, something quite dangerous was happening to the union she loved. The old British politics of left versus right, Labour versus Tory, the state versus the market, were giving way to something new, England versus Scotland, with the Conservative Party being seen more and more as the English party, with a set of values that weren't just alien, but actively hostile to what Scotland wanted. And so places like this, prosperous, aspirational, home-owning, natural Tory territory almost anywhere else in Britain, and which had been happily Tory in the past, now turned away from the Conservative Party. Why, though? Was Scotland really more left-wing than England? More compassionate, less aspirational, less concerned with private wealth? There's no firm evidence that Scotland was any of these things. So why were England and Scotland now voting so differently?
There were three things operating in my view. The first is the significant numbers of middle class and professional Scots who were employed in the public sector and who feared very much for their position, for their jobs. A second factor was that by the time you get to the late 1980s, there is a sense of an awareness, if you like, of the extraordinary damage done to Scotland, or at least to the old industrial structure of Scotland, by this particular regime. And I think the third factor is that the heavy industry in Scotland and everything that went with it was actually a badge of identity. And there was also developing awareness that whatever the rationality of these economic policies from the late 1970s and early 1980s, there was an awareness, I think, that the whole thing was handled far too rigorously, with too little sensitivity for Scottish opinion.
But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For Britishness, that familiar left-right battleground had one last big fight in it. In 1984, Britain's miners went on strike. There was no Scottish national dimension to this. The Scottish miners were in the same fight for the same ends against the same enemy as their comrades in Yorkshire, Nottinghamshire and South Wales.
Well, it was a great mood of optimism at the start of the miners' strike, that the miners could strike a blow for their own industry, the protection of their own industry. That's what it was. It was unlike most of the previous strikes, which had been about wages. This one was really a strike about the survival of the coal industry. And miners decided that they had no option but to take strike action to try and save the coal industry in Scotland. But the cost in social terms and in economic terms turned out to be appalling.
I think as miners are, you know, when they go down and face the conditions they worked in, it made them stronger because they knew they had to rely on each other. And I think the community showed that as well. And that was the strength that came out in the face of adversity. That when we knew we were being challenged, our very existence, that it actually strengthened us in a way and made us more determined to fight for that.
It was the last great political rising of a united British working class movement, the closing chapter in the story of this kind of organised labour. It had been a long and illustrious tale of solidarity, sacrifice and progress. That story had become a key component of Britain's shared national narrative, part of what had moulded the Britons we all were. Mrs Thatcher sent it back to work, defeated and demoralised.
In retrospect, you had a very intransigent Prime Minister who was hell-bent on